Hello, this is International Master Nigel Povar. Yesterday I ran session 12 for the Guildford Junior Chess Club, and for the top group I covered a series of king and pawn endings. I felt it was useful to tackle these because up until now we've focused primarily on opening play and middle game positions and hadn't really looked at all at any endgames. I thought it useful to start with king and pawn endgames because although they can be considered quite basic, there are a number of key principles that young players need to quickly become familiar with. So I started with this simple position of king and pawn versus king. And in fact, I gave them a slightly different position to begin with and just asked them to try and demonstrate their ability to promote a pawn. Some of them were quite good at it and seemed to handle it quite well. Others found it a little more challenging. But I quickly established the principle that they need to recognise that the best way to try and win these positions is to get your king in front of the pawn. And so in this particular example, we want to get the white king ideally onto one of those three highlighted squares on f6, g6 and h6, and if the white king can get there, the position is a simple win. So on that basis I said, right, what's the first move? And it was quite obvious that the king should go this way. Black rushes his king over, and now comes the first key question. Where do we put the king now? Somebody suggested king to f3, but I pointed out this is a serious blunder because after king here, king up, and now king here, black has established the opposition. That's when the kings are opposing one another, and the player that has to move has to make a concession and either step aside, or in this case one option would be to advance the white pawn and give check. But the problem with that move is that the white king is no longer going to be in front of the pawn, and once we get to that situation, and we'll see this in a moment, the position quickly ends up as a draw. So if we go back to this position, the right move is not king to f3 but king to g3, and this allows white to sort of outflank black. So the black king comes across, the white king comes to the side on h4, and now the black king shuttles over, but white now can get forward and he's now in front of his pawn, the first time he's achieved that. And after now king here by black, the right move now for white is to play king here, putting his king in front of the pawn, and that assures him access to one of the three highlighted squares on his next move. Please note it would be a big mistake to bring the pawn up, because after king here we then reach this rather unfortunate position where a very simple draw will be achieved, and most of you will have perhaps seen this idea, and we get a stalemate. So that would mean that white fails to win. So going back to this position, once the king is in front of the pawn, we now get king going to f7, say. h7 would not make any difference, we go the other way, and now the king can outflank with king here, king to g8, and now king h8, pawn to g6, king here, pawn there, and now this pawn is going to queen. So this is quite a simple win, and it highlights the importance of securing the opposition and getting your king in front of the pawn. We're going to look at another position now. Now in this second position we see a famous study composed by Reti in 1921, and this was known to at least one member of the group, but it's interesting, this study, because it rather astonishingly illustrates the geometry of the chessboard, and it points out the importance of what is called the square. And as I explained to the group, in king and pawn endings it's all about counting how many moves are required to queen a pawn and how many moves it is required for the king to perhaps capture the pawn and get into the appropriate square. And the square is formed when you look at how far the pawn has to travel to queen and create a square, and we'll see that in just a moment. In this particular position it looks pretty hopeless for white, because the white pawn on c6 has only got two moves to promote on c8, but the black king is close enough to be able to intercept it. Whereas the black pawn on h5 is way ahead of the white king on h8, and it clearly looks like there's no prospect for the white king to catch it. But unbelievably, it is in fact possible for white to do this, because he can combine the two ideas, and you'll see what I mean by that. So we start with him playing his king here, and black now pushes his pawn forward, and you can see now the square illustrated. The white king needs to be inside that square in order to intercept the pawn and catch it before it promotes. But it clearly looks like that's not going to be possible. However, we now play the king to f6, and in this particular position, if now black were to advance his pawn, then the white king enters the square of his own pawn, and that means the c6 pawn is going to be able to promote, as shown. So after h2, c7, and now both sides can queen, and if black prevents that with king to b7, then white plays king to d7, and then we get both sides achieving a queen, and this position will be a draw. So if we go back to the position after king to f6, instead of advancing the h-pawn, black can play his king to b6, and it appears now that he's going to be able to capture the c6 pawn. However, white now plays king to e5, and now he has two threats. Firstly, he threatens to protect his c6 pawn with king to d6, or to play king to f4 and enter the square. So, for example, if black plays king takes c6, then king to f4 sees the white king inside the square of the h-pawn, and that pawn will be lost. If instead black were to advance his h-pawn, white plays king to d6, and after h2, c7, king here, and once again both sides will queen, and this position will be a draw. So we use this study to help us understand the principle of the square, and this is something that will feature in further examples that we'll look at in just a moment. With this third king and pawn ending, I asked the group who they thought was winning, white or black, and their initial thought was that it was white, because they thought if the white king can get over and grab the b7 pawn, then he'll be able to escort his b6 pawn home. So we looked first of all at the king running over to the pawn, and black brings his king up the board, white continues over, and we reach a very interesting position here, where although black is attacking the b6 pawn, it's white to play, and we see though that there are two red highlighted squares which are sometimes referred to as mined squares, and in this instance the first player to step onto one of those mined squares will actually lose. And this is well illustrated here, because as now white plays king to b5, after king to a6 by black, black now guards his b7 pawn, and white now finds himself in Zugzwang, because if he were to move his king away, for example if he goes king back to d6, then after king takes b6, it is black who is a pawn ahead, and as his king sits in front of his pawn, black will have the simple task of just moving king and pawn up the board together and shepherding his pawn home, and there's very little white's going to be able to do about that so long as black keeps his king in front of the pawn. So this pointed out that if we go back to the original position, that it was not feasible for white to rush his king over and try and grab the b7 pawn. Therefore, what white needs to do in order to be able to try and hold this position is to see that when black captures the pawn on b6, which is almost inevitable, that white can then put his king on b4, and if he can achieve that, he will then have the opposition, and it will be impossible for black to make progress. Now, getting from the h4 square, where the king currently stands, to the b4 square takes 6 moves. However, there are countless different routes that white can take to go from h4 to b4, and in fact there are over 140 different routes, but only one of those routes is actually going to achieve the draw, and that's one of the fascinating things about the geometry of the chessboard. So let's look first of all at the most obvious move. Let's assume that white brings his king straight across, heading towards the b4 square. Well, black brings his king up, heading towards the b6 pawn, but at the same time heading towards the white king, because he hopes to be able to make it difficult for the king to get across. So for example, if white were to continue with king to f4 here, black would play king here, and if now he goes king to e5, king here, and in this situation it's going to be very difficult, nigh on impossible, for the white king to get to b4 in good time. So if we go back after king to c2, we see that maybe king f3 works, but then king d3, and again white would have to lose time. For example, king f2, king to c4, king here, king here, king here, king takes, and now after king to say c4, then black would simply play king to a5, and he's managed to he'll be able to advance his pawn, but more to the point, he's keeping his king ahead of that pawn, so he would win. So if we go back to the original position, the correct move for white, not immediately obvious, is king to g3, and now black brings his king up, white goes king to f2, and now if black goes king to d3, white goes king to e1. He's actually coming around behind the black king, and the game could continue like this. And in this situation, you can see the journey white has taken. He's just travelled down the line from h4 to e1, and then from e1 up to b4. And that's 6 moves, and he's got now the opposition. And if black steps aside to either c6 or a6, white steps aside the same way, and black can make no progress other than to advance his pawn, either 1 or 2 squares, when in either case the black king is no longer in front of his pawn, and this position would therefore be a draw. If we go back to the position after king f2, instead of say going king to d3, which is what we looked at just now, if black were to go king to d2, trying to prevent the white king from coming over, the correct move now for white is king to f1. And if black plays king to d1, white is very happy just to repeat moves. And if in this position now black tries king d3, then white can go king e1, and once again we get the same position. The white king will slide up to b4 once the black king is captured on b6. So this third position illustrates the importance of the opposition, and also, as I say, the geometry of the chessboard, and how there are many different routes that one can take to achieve or get to a key square. So we're now going to stop here and move on to our fourth and final position. This fourth position shows a fascinating study by Troitsky, published in 1913, and it's really interesting because there are a number of interesting features in the position. I asked the group who they thought was winning, and it didn't take them long to conclude that white ought to be winning, because white can make an outside pass pawn with his a pawn. And we'll see in a moment just how that proves to be quite a critical feature of this position. So the first thought one would have in this position is, well, okay, let's try and create that pass pawn with a4. The problem with this, though, is that black can afford to ignore that pawn and simply play king to g3. Notice now that the white king is trapped on g1, and although white can go on and advance his a pawn and get a queen, black rushes his h pawn up the board, and by the time white has queened, black then can deliver mate. And very annoyingly for white, there's absolutely nothing he can do to prevent that mate once he's allowed this position to arise on the board, i.e. black has played king g3. So if we go back to the original position, one might conclude therefore that the right move for white in this position should be to capture this pawn on g2 in order to avoid that mating variation. The problem here, though, is that black can immediately bring his king over, and now after a4, white is threatening to rush the pawn on, so black captures it, the pawn recaptures, and now black enters the square of the white pawn. Notice that we don't take the f5 pawn, and you'll see later why we don't, but by going to f6 we have now entered the square, and there's no way white can prevent the journey king e7 to d8 to c8 to b7 to a8 or a7. In other words, the white pawn will be intercepted, and this is the way it could go. And in this instance, black would capture the white pawn next and be left with a winning position because he has an extra pawn on h7 and loads of time to be able to bring the black king into active play to help black win the position. So again, if we go back to the beginning, we now know that a4 doesn't work. We also know that king takes g2 doesn't work. So that, by a process of elimination, really guides us to finding the winning move, a very clever move, f6. And after this, black must capture it, otherwise the pawn would rush on to queen. And after the following moves, now again we must take on g2, otherwise mate would follow with king g3, followed by the advance of the h-pawn. And in this position, black now plays king g5, we play a4, the pawns are exchanged, and king f5. Notice black has now entered the square of the white a-pawn. The white pawn advances, and we now again move into the square, staying within the square of the a-pawn. And now a key move arises. It would be wrong to play a5 because after king takes d5, black would slide down the white diagonal, he'd be in the square of the pawn, and he would intercept that a-pawn. So now comes a very clever move. White plays pawn to d6, which creates an obstruction. And now if black captures, which is pretty much the obvious move, note that c6, note that to go c6 here would allow a5 and king here, and then a6, king takes, a7, and white would queen. So instead, after d6, black captures, and now another very clever move here, c6, not pushing the pawn on, because king d5 would again see the black king sliding down the diagonal and intercepting that white a-pawn. By playing this sacrifice on c6, black must capture. Now the white pawn advances. Black gets into the a-pawn's square once again, but after a6, notice the c6 square is occupied by the black pawn, thus denying black king c6, which will bring him into the square. Therefore the white a-pawn will promote. So what's clever about this particular study is the way that white sacrificed pawns on f6, d6 and c6, in each case to prevent the black king from entering the square of the pawn. So an incredible study, and one that's well worth sort of knowing and playing over. So these endings, which I'm going to leave here now, illustrate the importance of concepts like the oppositioning king and pawn endings, getting your king in front of a pawn when you're trying to escort it home, knowing how to calculate when you enter the square and trying to get into the square of a pawn, a passed pawn, to try and prevent it, and other such concepts. So I hope these endings prove useful and help you to start to understand king and pawn endings better.